시청자 여러분 안녕하십니까. 굿모닝인포맥스 2부 오늘도 힘차게 문을 열어보겠습니다. 먼저 연합인포맥스 기자 군단의 취재파일로 시작하겠습니다.
네, 오늘은 서영태 기자가요. 글로벌 신용평가사죠. 스탠더드앤드푸어스 상무를 만나서 우리나라 경제에 대해서 인터뷰를 해왔다고 하는데요. 과연 글로벌 신용평가사는 지금 우리나라를 어떻게 바라보고 있는지 화면으로 함께 만나보시겠습니다.
Thank you for joining us. Would you just introduce yourself to the audience briefly?
Okay, so I'm Kim Tan. I'm responsible for Asia Pacific sovereign ratings in S&P글로벌 ratings.
So your job is covering the South Korean government's credit rating, right?
Well, as part of that, yes, I actually cover analytics and research for sovereign ratings in the Asia Pacific region. But personally, I'm also the main or primary analyst for the Korean sovereign rating.
So that makes you a very important person to South Korean people, right?
I don't think so.
So let's start with the first question. So S&P글로벌 expects the South Korea to grow 1.1% this year.
Yes.
And if this number is lower than the previous one, what made you to change the number?
Yes, our economists do believe that South Korea's economy will grow by 1.1% this year. But previously, we had expected that it would be slightly stronger, 1.4%. It was only at the end of March that we revised down this number. The revision downwards largely reflected external factors. Since we last had our forecast in late last year, the global economy has slowed much faster than we thought. And as a result, we also think that exports out of Korea, as well as export-related investment in Korea, are likely to be negatively affected. That's why we revised down our growth forecast.
So I guess the slowing down of global economy and semiconductors industry are having a bad season, so that caused you to downgrade the rating, downgrade the numbers, right? So the second question is that what is the biggest threat that South Korea's economy may face in the future?
Well, firstly, we don't see too many major or obvious risks domestically. So even though we do see some weakness in the real estate sector and high household debt, we don't think these will be in themselves reasons for causing the economy to go slower than we currently expect. So the main risks to our forecast, according to our economists, is that the global economy could slow much faster than we currently expect for whatever reason. For instance, if the US is forced to raise interest rates much more than we currently expect, or if the situation in Europe deteriorates and cause global economic uncertainties to increase significantly. Another reason could also be that for whatever reason, China's economic rebound post-COVID, starts to stutter or slow down much more than we think.
So since the South Korea is a manufacturing hub to global economy, so global demand matters. So I want to ask about geopolitics then. You explained about the economic factors. Let's talk about geopolitics, like the U.S.-China tension and North Korea's missile threat and war in Ukraine. These kind of risks, geopolitical risks. Is this risk gonna hurt our economic fundamentals in the future?
Well, I don't think it will materially worsen Korea's fundamentals. However, it is likely to be negative for growth going forward. Firstly, with all the restrictions that arise from all the trade and investment restrictions arising from US-China tensions, we are likely to see the global economy slow down compared to what would otherwise have been the case. So that is going to matter for Korea's exports and therefore Korea's economic growth. Now, secondly, the restrictions affect major Korean exporters very directly. So now you cannot sell as freely or invest as freely in China. And on the other hand, you have subsidies coming in Europe, in the US, and therefore more competition. And at the same time, China is also subsidizing as a result of all these restrictions on itself. So all these are likely to be negative factors for Korean companies that export internationally. And firstly, they're going to have smaller market growth. Secondly, they're going to have more competition. And thirdly, they have to face competitors who are subsidized by very rich governments. So all this, I think, will pose in the near term be putting negative pressures on the Korean economy.
So these negative factors are not bad enough to affect South Korea's credit ratings, right?
No, it doesn't. I mean, at the end of the day, what matters is how quickly South Korea's economy grow compared to other high-income economies. The factors that I just mentioned that will drag down Korea's growth will affect other economies as well. And in Europe, for instance, the economies there face additional troubles of geopolitics and the war associated with Russia and Ukraine. So all of this just means that even if Korea does grow slower compared to in the past, it will still be an outperformer among all the high-income countries.
Thank you for your optimistic view. Okay, so, but South Korean people, I think they're much pessimistic than what you think, because the South Korean government has introduced structural reforms. They say we have to reform the labor market, pension system, and education system, unless the demographic challenge and the productivity problems gonna hurt our economy very bad. So if this country fail to reform these kind of things, I think the possibility is quite big because the politicians are there. I don't think they are showing their leadership right. So what are possible consequences that after the failure of reforms? Let's just assume that the reforms fail. Okay.
Well, firstly, even though I say that Korea, in our view, continues to outperform other high-income economies in the future, it is still a lot slower compared to in the past. So, of course, the people who live here will feel the changes. Optimism will not be as strong, and income growth may not be as high. So that is one thing to take note of. Secondly, now in any economy, there's always a need for ongoing reforms because the environment changes, and your economy has to adapt to these changes. And the principal method of adapting is by conducting changes through reforms. And that would really preserve your ability to continue to be nimble and continue relatively good growth in the future. But if we believe that reforms in South Korea are unlikely to happen, as you said, then given that we now have a much more complex geopolitical international environment that is affecting Korean companies, exporters especially, quite seriously, then this source of growth will no longer be as strong as it used to be. And then we have to think about what that has to do, how that impacts domestic demand. We already have an issue of household debt being prominently reported. And if interest rates were to go up, as they probably would, then households will be constrained in their purchasing power because they have to pay more for their debt. And already we have seen debt servicing ratios worsening. So that it will weigh down the economy. Now, the second thing is Korea is one of the fastest aging economy in this region. I mean, right now the average age is not very high, but it's going to deteriorate very quickly in the near future. So without additional changes in the structure of the economy to ensure that your productivity improve from today, it just means that the economy may be dragged down just because fewer and fewer people are entering the workforce. And even if you assume that a large proportion of people who would have reached retirement age will stay on, the fact is, generally, older workers tend to be less able to absorb new knowledge. And therefore, again, that may negatively affect their productivity, which all means that there is a higher risk than what we currently see now, that the Korean economic growth may fall in line with other high-income economies, which is to say it no longer is outperform.
Okay. So let's talk about credit issues debt. So South Korea's national debt is growing very fast. So South Korean reporters are writing stories about the national debt and like the potential threat to the economy and future generations and things like that. But I wonder, is the level of the government debt truly high compared to the peer groups?
Okay, firstly, we have to define debt. Right? Most people say the government's debt is very high because they look at the gross debt level, total debt that the government owes, and that is reaching levels that are unseen in the past, which is why there's some concern about it. But the way we measure is because all governments have debt, but not all governments have a lot of assets. In the case of Korea, the government has a lot of financial assets as well, because through the pension system, social security collections, it invests in a lot of financial assets. So if you take total debt and you minus off the amounts that is backed by liquid assets, the Korean government net debt level is actually rather low compared to especially high-income economies. So at this point in time, I don't think the level of debt that is shouldered by the Korean government is excessively high. Now, the one thing is, of course, apart from the government's own debt, there's also debt that the government may have to support if the economy slows down. And I'm referring to the debt shouldered by companies such as KEPCO, Go-Gas, and Korean Expressway, and Land and Housing. All of these are government-owned companies. To some extent, they carry out some aspects of the government's policy. For instance, KEPCO has been in the news very much because it doesn't raise electricity tariffs by as much as it would need to recover its cost. And that has caused it to run up its debt. So this amount of debt, this debt shouldered by the non-government and the non-financial public enterprises has been increasing as a share of GDP. Which contrasts with the trend before 2019. So I think if this trend were to continue, then we may have to worry about the government having to put money into trying to pay down some of this debt or augmenting the financial status of these companies. But in the past, we have seen that when times are less pressing, the government has been able to bring down the level of debt vis-a-vis GDP. So hopefully, once we are out of this down cycle in the economy, the Korean government will do that again.
So you mentioned about the high household debt, and the high household debt can affect the household to consume less, right? But if that household debt only affects the consumption, I think that's a good scenario that we can take. But some experts said that the high household debt may provoke a financial crisis. And some say it's not going to happen. And what is your stance?
Okay, our view is that high household debt is a weakness, but it's unlikely to provoke an economic recession or a financial crisis by itself. And the reason I say that is because we see that the regulators, financial regulators and the government in Korea have been very vigilant about household debt and banking sector stability for many, many years. So you have seen that the restrictions on banks when they lend out to households are pretty stiff compared to other jurisdictions in the world. So the quality of this debt, or the safety of this debt rather, is pretty good in a normal economic scenario, right? So even if we do see a slowdown in growth or even a recession, we're unlikely to see these loans or household debt becoming a trigger for a financial crisis by themselves. Just because, as I said, I think the credit metrics, credit qualities behind these loans are pretty good. However, because high household debts are high, if for whatever reason Korea's economy were to be hit by an external shock, and it slows significantly, causing a lot of unemployment and exacerbated perhaps by high inflation and interest rates, then the fact that households owe a lot of debt may become a contributing factor to worsening the economic and financial situation. So that is the risk we see for Korean household debt.
Okay. This is the last question. So, if you have to adjust the sovereign credit rating, it's AA stable, right? You have to adjust it. In what situation you would adjust that in the near future? Yeah.
Well, the financial and economic metrics, as well as the fiscal metrics underpinning the Korean AA rating are very strong. Even if we see some weaknesses and deteriorations, we don't think by themselves they will cause the rating to come down. So the main likely reason that that could cause us to lower the rating remains serious instability in the geopolitical situation, especially with regards to North Korea. That we think is the most likely reason in the next 1 to 2 years that we could lower the rating.
I think we can finish this interview.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
네, 이렇게 보면 결국 S&P는 올해 한국의 경제 성장률을 1.1%로 낮춰서 제시했고요.
네.
한국 경제 부담 요인으로는 가계 부채를 꼽은 겁니다. 다행인 부분은 그래도 한국의 국가 신용 등급은 현재 AA 안정적 전망을 유지하고 있는 게 아닌가 싶습니다.
네, 맞습니다. 하반기에도 우리 경제 반등 계기가 좀 마련됐으면 좋겠다라는 바람을 가져보면서 서영태 기자의 인터뷰는 여기서 마무리 짓겠습니다. 이어서 바로 경제 언박싱 코너로 넘어가 보겠습니다.